Page 174. The Heroic Slave. Part 1. O child of grief, why weepest thou? Why droops thy sadden mournful brow? Why is thy look so like despair? What deep, sad sorrow lingers there? The state of Virginia is famous in American annals for the multitudinous array of her statesmen and heroes. She has been dignified by some the mother of statesmen. History has not been sparing in recording their names, or emblazoning their deeds. Her high position in this respect has given her an enviable distinction among her sister states. With Virginia for his birthplace, even a man of ordinary parts, on account of the general partiality for her sons, easily rises to eminent stations. Men, not great enough to attract special attention in their native states, have, like a certain distinguished citizen in the state of New York, sighed and repined that they were not born in Virginia. Yet not all the great ones of the old. Page 175. Dominion have, by the fact of their birthplace, escaped undeserved obscurity. By some strange neglect, one of the truest, manliest, and bravest of her children, one who, in after years, will, I think, command the pen of genius to set his merits forth, holds now no higher place in the records of that grand old commonwealth than is held by a horse or an ox. Let those account for it who can, but there stands the fact, that a man who loved liberty as well as did Patrick Henry, who deserved it as much as Thomas Jefferson, and who fought for it with a valor as high, an arm as strong, and against odds as great, as he who led all the armies of the American colonies through the great war for freedom and independence, lives now only in the chattel records of his native state. Glimpses of this great character are all that can now be presented. He is brought to view only by a few transient incidents, and these afford but partial satisfaction. Like a guiding star on a stormy night, he is seen through the parted clouds and the howling tempests, or, like the gray peak of a menacing rock on a perilous coast, he is seen by the quivering flash of angry lightning, and he again disappears covered with mystery. Curiously, earnestly, anxiously we peer into the dark, and wish even for the blinding flash, or the light of northern skies to reveal him. But alas! He is still enveloped in darkness, and we return from the pursuit like a wearied and disheartened mother, after a tedious and unsuccessful search for a lost. Page 176. Child, who returns weighed down with disappointment and sorrow. Speaking of marks, traces, possibles, and probabilities, we come before our readers. In the spring of 1835, on a Sabbath morning, within hearing of the solemn peals of the church bells at a distant village, a northern traveler through the state of Virginia drew up his horse to drink at a sparkling brook, near the edge of a dark pine forest. While his weary and thirsty steed drew in the grateful water, the rider caught the sound of a human voice, apparently engaged in earnest conversation. Following the direction of the sound, he descried, among the tall pines, the man whose voice had arrested his attention. To whom can he be speaking? Thought the traveler. He seems to be alone. The circumstance interested him much, and he became intensely curious to know what thoughts and feelings, or, it might be, high aspirations, guided those rich and mellow accents. Tying his horse at a short distance from the brook, he stealthily drew near the solitary speaker, and, concealing himself by the side of a huge fallen tree, he distinctly heard the following soliloquy: What, then, is life to me? It is aimless and worthless, and worse than worthless. Those birds, perched on yon swinging boughs, in friendly conclave, sounding forth their merry notes in seeming worship of the rising sun, though liable. Page 177. To the sportsman's fowling piece, are still my superiors. They live free, though they may die slaves. They fly where they list by day, and retire in freedom at night. But what is freedom to me, or I to it? I am a slave, born a slave, an abject slave, even before I made part of this breathing world, the scourge was plaited for my back, the fetters were forged for my limbs. How mean a thing am I, that accursed and crawling snake, that miserable reptile, that has just glided into its slimy home, is freer and better off than I. He escaped my blow, and is safe. But here am I, a man, yes, a man, with thoughts and wishes, with powers and faculties as far as angels' flight above that hated reptile, yet he is my superior, and scorns to own me as his master, or to stop to take my blows. When he saw my uplifted arm, he darted beyond my reach, and turned to give me battle. I dare not do as much as that. I neither run nor fight, but do meanly stand, answering each heavy blow of a cruel master with doleful wails and piteous cries. I am galled with irons, but even these are more tolerable than the galling consciousness of cowardice and indecision. Can it be that I dare not run away? Perish the thought, I dare do anything which may be done by another. When that young man struggled with the waves for life, and others stood back appalled in helpless horror, did I not plunge in, forgetful of life, to save his? The raging bull from whom all others fled, pale with. Page 178. Fright, did I not keep at bay with a single pitchfork? Could a coward do that? No, I wrong myself, I am no coward. Liberty I will have, or die in the attempt to gain it. This working that others may live in idleness. This cringing submission to insolence and curses. This living under the constant dread and apprehension of being sold and transferred, like a mere brute, is too much for me. I will stand it no longer. What others have done, I will do. These trusty legs, or these sinewy arms shall place me among the free. Tom escaped, so can I. The North Star will not be less kind to me than to him. I will follow it. I will at least make the trial. I have nothing to lose. If I am caught, I shall only be a slave. If I am shot, I shall only lose a life which is a burden and a curse. If I get clear, as something tells me I shall, liberty, the inalienable birthright of every man, precious and priceless, will be mine. My resolution is fixed. I shall be free. At these words the traveler raised his head cautiously and noiselessly, and caught, from his hiding place, a full view of the unsuspecting speaker. Madison, for that was the name of our hero, was standing erect, a smile of satisfaction rippled upon his expressive countenance, like that which plays upon the face of one who has but just solved a difficult problem, or vanquished a malignant foe, for at that moment he was free, at least in spirit. The future gleamed brightly before him, and his fetters lay broken at his feet. His air was triumphant. Page 179. Madison was of manly form. Tall, symmetrical, round, and strong. In his movements he seemed to combine, with the strength of the lion, a lion's elasticity. His torn sleeves disclosed arms like polished iron. His face was black, but comely. His eye, lit with emotion, kept guard under a brow as dark and as glossy as the raven's wing. His whole appearance betokened Herculean strength, yet there was nothing savage or forbidding in his aspect. A child might play in his arms, or dance on his shoulders. A giant's strength, but not a giant's heart was in him. His broad mouth and nose spoke only of good nature and kindness. But his voice, that unfailing index of the soul, though full and melodious, had that in it which could terrify as well as charm. He was just the man you would choose when hardships were to be endured, or danger to be encountered, intelligent and brave. He had the head to conceive, and the hand to execute. In a word, he was one to be sought as a friend, but to be dreaded as an enemy. As our traveler gazed upon him, he almost trembled at the thought of his dangerous intrusion. Still he could not quit the place. He had long desired to sound the mysterious depths of the thoughts and feelings of a slave. He was not, therefore, disposed to allow so providential an opportunity to pass unimproved. He resolved to hear more, so he listened again for those mellow and mournful accents which, he says, made such an page 180 impression upon him as can never be erased. He did not have to wait long. There came another gush from the same full fountain, now bitter, and now sweet. Scathing denunciations of the cruelty and injustice of slavery, heart-touching narrations of his own personal suffering, intermingled with prayers to the God of the oppressed for help and deliverance, were followed by presentations of the dangers and difficulties of escape, and formed the burden of his eloquent utterances, but his high resolution clung to him, for he ended each speech by an emphatic declaration of his purpose to be free. It seemed that the very repetition of this imparted a glow to his countenance. The hope of freedom seemed to sweeten, for a season, the bitter cup of slavery, and to make it, for a time, tolerable, for when in the very whirlwind of anguish, when his heart's cord seemed screwed up to snapping tension, hope sprung up and soothed his troubled spirit. Fitfully he would exclaim, "How can I leave her? Poor thing! What can she do when I am gone? Oh! Oh! 'Tis impossible that I can leave poor Susan." A brief pause intervened. Our traveler raised his head, and saw again the sorrow-smitten slave. His eye was fixed upon the ground. The strong man staggered under a heavy load. Recovering himself, he argued thus aloud, "All is uncertain here. Tomorrow's sun may not rise before I'm sold, and separated from her I love. What, then, could I do for her? I should be in more hopeless." Page 181. Slavery, and she no nearer to liberty, whereas if I were free, my arms my own, I might devise the means to rescue her. This said, Madison cast around a searching glance, as if the thought of being overheard had flashed across his mind. He said no more, but, with measured steps, walked away, and was lost to the eye of our traveler amidst the wildering woods. Long after Madison had left the ground, Mr. Listwell, our traveler, remained in motionless silence, meditating on the extraordinary revelations to which he had listened. He seemed fastened to the spot, and stood half hoping, half fearing the return of the sable preacher to his solitary temple. The speech of Madison rung through the chambers of his soul, and vibrated through his entire frame. Here is indeed a man, thought he, of rare endowments, a child of God, guilty of no crime but the color of his skin, hiding away from the face of humanity, and pouring out his thoughts and feelings, his hopes and resolutions to the lonely woods. To him those distant church bells have no grateful music. He shuns the church, the altar, and the great congregation of Christian worshippers, and wanders away to the gloomy forest, to utter in the vacant air complaints and griefs, which the religion of his times and his country can neither console nor relieve. Goaded almost to madness by the sense of the injustice done him, he resorts hither to give. Page 182. To his pent-up feelings, and to debate with himself the feasibility of plans of his own invention, for his own deliverance. From this hour I am an abolitionist. I have seen enough and heard enough, and I shall go to my home in Ohio resolved to atone for my past indifference to this ill-starred race, by making such exertions as I shall be able to do, for the speedy emancipation of every slave in the land. Part 2. The gaudy, blowing and remorseful day is crept into the bosom of the sea. And now loud howling wolves arouse the jades that drag the tragic melancholy night, who with their drowsy, slow, and flagging wings clip dead men's graves, and from their misty jaws breathe foul contagions, darkness in the air. Shakespeare. 5 years after the foregoing singular occurrence, in the winter of 1840, Mr. and Mrs. Listwell sat together by the fireside of their own happy home, in the state of Ohio. The children were all gone to bed. A single lamp burnt brightly on the center table. All was still and comfortable within, but the night was cold and dark, a heavy wind sighed. Page 183. And moaned sorrowfully around the house and barn, occasionally bringing against the clattering windows a stray leaf from the large oak trees that embowered their dwelling. It was a night for strange noises and for strange fancies. A whole wilderness of thought might pass through one's mind during such an evening. The smoldering embers, partaking of the spirit of the restless night, became fruitful of varied and fantastic pictures, and revived many bygone scenes and old impressions. The happy pair seemed to sit in silent fascination, gazing on the fire. Suddenly this reverie was interrupted by a heavy growl. Ordinarily such an occurrence would have scarcely provoked a single word, or excited the least apprehension. But there are certain seasons when the slightest sound sends a jar through all the subtle chambers of the mind, and such a season was this. The happy pair started up, as if some sudden danger had come upon them. The growl was from their trusty watchdog. "What can it mean? Certainly no one can be out on such a night as this," said Mrs. Listwell. "The wind has deceived the dog, my dear. He has mistaken the noise of falling branches, brought down by the wind, for that of the footsteps of persons coming to the house. I have several times tonight thought that I heard the sound of footsteps. I am sure, however, that it was but the wind. Friends would not be likely to come out at such an hour, or such a night, and thieves are." Page 184. Too lazy and self-indulgent to expose themselves to this biting frost, but should there be anyone about, our brave old Monty, who is on the lookout, will not be slow in sounding the alarm. Saying this they quietly left the window, whither they had gone to learn the cause of the menacing growl, and reseated themselves by the fire, as if reluctant to leave the slowly expiring embers, although the hour was late. A few minutes only intervened after resuming their seats, when again their sober meditations were disturbed. Their faithful dog now growled and barked furiously, as if assailed by an advancing foe. Simultaneously the good couple arose, and stood in mute expectation. The contest without seemed fierce and violent. It was, however, soon over. The barking ceased, for, with true canine instinct, Monty quickly discovered that a friend, not an enemy of the family, was coming to the house, and instead of rushing to repel the supposed intruder, he was now at the door, whimpering and dancing for the admission of himself and his newly made friend. Mr. Listwell knew by this movement that all was well. He advanced and opened the door, and saw by the light that streamed out into the darkness, a tall man advancing slowly towards the house, with a stick in one hand, and a small bundle in the other. "It is a traveler," thought he, "who has missed his way, and is coming to inquire the road. I am glad we did not go to." Page 185. "Bet earlier, I have felt all the evening as if somebody would be here tonight." The man had now halted a short distance from the door, and looked prepared alike for flight or battle. "Come in, sir, don't be alarmed, you have probably lost your way." Slightly hesitating, the traveler walked in, not, however, without regarding his host with a scrutinizing glance. "No, sir," said he, "I have come to ask you a greater favor." Instantly Mr. Listwell exclaimed, as the recollection of the Virginia forest scene flashed upon him, "Oh, sir, I know not your name, but I have seen your face, and heard your voice before. I am glad to see you. I know all. You are flying for your liberty, be seated, banish all fear. You are safe under my roof." This recognition, so unexpected, rather disconcerted and disquieted the noble fugitive. The timidity and suspicion of persons escaping from slavery are easily awakened, and often what is intended to dispel the one, and to allay the other, has precisely the opposite effect. It was so in this case. Quickly observing the unhappy impression made by his words and action, Mr. Listwell assumed a more quiet and inquiring aspect, and finally succeeded in removing the apprehensions which his very natural and generous salutation had aroused. Thus assured, the stranger said, "Sir, you have rightly guessed, I am, indeed, a fugitive from slavery." Page 186. "My name is Madison, Madison Washington, my mother used to call me. I am on my way to Canada, where I learned that persons of my color are protected in all the rights of men, and my object in calling upon you was, to beg the privilege of resting my weary limbs for the night in your barn. It was my purpose to have continued my journey till morning, but the piercing cold, and the frowning darkness compelled me to seek shelter, and, seeing a light through the lattice of your window, I was encouraged to come here to beg the privilege named. You will do me a great favor by affording me shelter for the night. A resting place, indeed, sir, you shall have, not, however, in my barn, but in the best room of my house. Consider yourself, if you please, under the roof of a friend, for such I am to you, and to all your deeply injured race." While this introductory conversation was going on, the kind lady had revived the fire, and was diligently preparing supper, for she, not less than her husband, felt for the sorrows of the oppressed and hunted ones of earth, and was always glad of an opportunity to do them a service. A bountiful repast was quickly prepared, and the hungry and toil-worn bondman was cordially invited to partake thereof. Gratefully he acknowledged the favor of his benevolent benefactress, but appeared scarcely to understand what such hospitality could mean. It was the first time in his life that he had. Page 187. Met so humane and friendly a greeting at the hands of persons whose color was unlike his own, yet it was impossible for him to doubt the charitableness of his new friends, or the genuineness of the welcome so freely given, and he therefore, with many thanks, took his seat at the table with Mr. and Mrs. Listwell, who, desirous to make him feel at home, took a cup of tea themselves, while urging upon Madison the best that the house could afford. Supper over, all doubts and apprehensions vanished, the three drew around the blazing fire, and a conversation commenced which lasted till long after midnight. "Now," said Madison to Mr. Listwell, "I was a little surprised and alarmed when I came in, by what you said. Do tell me, sir, why you thought you had seen my face before, and by what you knew me to be a fugitive from slavery, for I am sure that I never was before in this neighborhood, and I certainly sought to conceal what I supposed to be the manner of a fugitive slave." Mr. Listwell at once frankly disclosed the secret, describing the place where he first saw him, rehearsing the language which he, Madison, had used, referring to the effect which his manner and speech had made upon him, declaring the resolution he there formed to be an abolitionist, telling how often he had spoken of the circumstance, and the deep concern he had ever since felt to know what had become of him, and whether he had carried. Page 188. Out the purpose to make his escape, as in the woods he declared he would do. "Ever since that morning," said Mr. Listwell, "you have seldom been absent from my mind, and though now I did not dare to hope that I should ever see you again, I have often wished that such might be my fortune, for, from that hour, your face seemed to be daguerreotyped on my memory." Madison looked quite astonished, and felt amazed at the narration to which he had listened. After recovering himself he said, "I well remember that morning, and the bitter anguish that wrung my heart. I will state the occasion of it. I had, on the previous Saturday, suffered a cruel lashing, had been tied up to the limb of a tree, with my feet chained together, and a heavy iron bar placed between my ankles. Thus suspended, I received on my naked back 40 stripes, and was kept in this distressing position 3 or 4 hours, and was then let down, only to have my torture increased, for my bleeding back, gashed by the cow's skin, was washed by the overseer with old brine, partly to augment my suffering, and partly, as he said, to prevent inflammation. My crime was that I had stayed longer at the mill, the day previous, than it was thought I ought to have done, which, I assured my master and the overseer, was no fault of mine, but no excuses were allowed. "Hold your tongue, you impudent rascal," met my every explanation. Slaveholders are so imperious when their passions are excited, as to. Page 189. Construe every word of the slave into insolence. I could do nothing but submit to the agonizing infliction. Smarting still from the wounds, as well as from the consciousness of being whipped for no cause, I took advantage of the absence of my master, who had gone to church, to spend the time in the woods, and brood over my wretched lot. Oh, sir, I remember it well, and can never forget it. But this was 5 years ago. Where have you been since? I will try to tell you, said Madison. Just 4 weeks after that Sabbath morning, I gathered up the few rags of clothing I had, and started, as I supposed, for the North and for freedom. I must not stop to describe my feelings on taking this step. It seemed like taking a leap into the dark. The thought of leaving my poor wife and 2 little children caused me indescribable anguish, but consoling myself with the reflection that once free, I could, possibly, devise ways and means to gain their freedom also, I nerved myself up to make the attempt. I started, but ill luck attended me, for after being out a whole week, strange to say, I still found myself on my master's grounds. The 3rd night after being out, a season of clouds and rain set in, wholly preventing me from seeing the North Star, which I had trusted as my guide, not dreaming that clouds might intervene between us. This circumstance was fatal to my project, for page 190. In losing my star, I lost my way, so when I supposed I was far towards the north, and had almost gained my freedom, I discovered myself at the very point from which I had started. It was a severe trial, for I arrived at home in great destitution, my feet were sore, and in traveling in the dark, I had dashed my foot against a stump, and started a nail, and lamed myself. I was wet and cold, 1 week had exhausted all my stores, and when I landed on my master's plantation, with all my work to do over again, hungry, tired, lame, and bewildered, I almost cursed the day that I was born. In this extremity I approached the quarters. I did so stealthily, although in my desperation I hardly cared whether I was discovered or not. Peeping through the rents of the quarters, I saw my fellow slaves seated by a warm fire, merrily passing away the time, as though their hearts knew no sorrow. Although I envied their seeming contentment, all wretched as I was, I despised the cowardly acquiescence in their own degradation which it implied, and felt a kind of pride and glory in my own desperate lot. I dared not enter the quarters, for where there is seeming contentment with slavery, there is certain treachery to freedom. I proceeded towards the great house, in the hope of catching a glimpse of my poor wife, whom I knew might be trusted with my secrets even on the scaffold. Just as I reached the fence which divided the field from the garden, I saw a woman in the yard, who in the darkness I took to page 191. Be my wife, but a nearer approach told me it was not she. I was about to speak. Had I done so, I would not have been here this night, for an alarm would have been sounded, and the hunters been put on my track. Here were hunger, cold, thirst, disappointment, and chagrin, confronted only by the dim hope of liberty. I tremble to think of that dreadful hour. To face the deadly cannon's mouth in warm blood unterrified, is, I think, a small achievement, compared with a conflict like this with gaunt starvation. The gnawings of hunger conquers by degrees, till all that a man has he would give in exchange for a single crust of bread. Thank God, I was not quite reduced to this extremity. Happily for me, before the fatal moment of utter despair, my good wife made her appearance in the yard. It was she. I knew her step. All was well now. I was, however, afraid to speak, lest I should frighten her. Yet speak I did, and, to my great joy, my voice was known. Our meeting can be more easily imagined than described. For a time hunger, thirst, weariness, and lameness were forgotten. But it was soon necessary for her to return to the house. She being a house servant, her absence from the kitchen, if discovered, might have excited suspicion. Our parting was like tearing the flesh from my bones, yet it was the part of wisdom for her to go. She left me with the purpose of meeting me at midnight in the very forest where you last saw me. She knew the place well. Page 192. As one of my melancholy resorts, and could easily find it, though the night was stark. I hastened away, therefore, and concealed myself, to await the arrival of my good angel. As I lay there among the leaves, I was strongly tempted to return again to the house of my master and give myself up, but remembering my solemn pledge on that memorable Sunday morning, I was able to linger out the 2 long hours between 10 and midnight. I may well call them long hours. I have endured much hardship, I have encountered many perils, but the anxiety of those 2 hours was the bitterest I ever experienced. True to her word, my wife came laden with provisions, and we sat down on the side of a log, at that dark and lonesome hour of the night. I cannot say we talked, our feelings were too great for that, yet we came to an understanding that I should make the woods my home, for if I gave myself up, I should be whipped and sold away, and if I started for the north, I should leave a wife doubly dear to me. We mutually determined, therefore, that I should remain in the vicinity. In the dismal swamps I lived, sir, 5 long years, a cave for my home during the day. I wandered about at night with the wolf and the bear, sustained by the promise that my good Susan would meet me in the pine woods at least once a week. This promise was redeemed, I assure you, to the letter, greatly to my relief. I had partly become contented with my mode of page 193. Life, and had made up my mind to spend my days there, but the wilderness that sheltered me thus long took fire, and refused longer to be my hiding place. I will not harrow up your feelings by portraying the terrific scene of this awful conflagration. There is nothing to which I can liken it. It was horribly and indescribably grand. The whole world seemed on fire, and it appeared to me that the day of judgment had come, that the burning bowels of the earth had burst forth, and that the end of all things was at hand. Bears and wolves, scorched from their mysterious hiding places in the earth, and all the wild inhabitants of the untrodden forest, filled with a common dismay, ran forth, yelling, howling, bewildered amidst the smoke and flame. The very heavens seemed to rain down fire through the towering trees. It was by the merest chance that I escaped the devouring element. Running before it, and stopping occasionally to take breath, I looked back to behold its frightful ravages, and to drink in its savage magnificence. It was awful, thrilling, solemn, beyond compare. When aided by the fitful wind, the merciless tempest of fire swept on, sparkling, creaking, cracking, curling, roaring, outdoing in its dreadful splendor 1,000 thunderstorms at once. From tree to tree it leaped, swallowing them up in its lurid, baleful glare, and leaving them leafless, limbless, charred, and lifeless behind. The scene was overwhelming, stunning, nothing was. Page 194. Spared, cattle, tame and wild, herds of swine and of deer, wild beasts of every name and kind, huge night birds, bats, and owls, that had retired to their homes in lofty treetops to rest, perished in that fiery storm. The long-winged buzzard and croaking raven mingled their dismal cries with those of the countless myriads of small birds that rose up to the skies, and were lost to the sight in clouds of smoke and flame. Oh, I shudder when I think of it. Many a poor wandering fugitive, who, like myself, had sought among wild beasts the mercy denied by our fellow men, saw, in helpless consternation, his dwelling place and city of refuge reduced to ashes forever. It was this grand conflagration that drove me hither. I ran alike from fire and from slavery. After a slight pause, for both speaker and hearers were deeply moved by the above recital, Mr. Listwell, addressing Madison, said, "If it does not weary you too much, do tell us something of your journeyings since this disastrous burning, we are deeply interested in everything which can throw light on the hardships of persons escaping from slavery. We could hear you talk all night. Are there no incidents that you could relate of your travels hither? Or are they such that you do not like to mention them?" "For the most part, sir, my course has been uninterrupted, and, considering the circumstances, at times even pleasant. I have suffered little for want of food, but I need not tell you how I got." Page 195. Your moral code may differ from mine, as your customs and usages are different. The fact is, sir, during my flight, I felt myself robbed by society of all my just rights, that I was in an enemy's land, who sought both my life and my liberty. They had transformed me into a brute, made merchandise of my body, and, for all the purposes of my flight, turned day into night, and guided by my own necessities, and in contempt of their conventionalities, I did not scruple to take bread where I could get it. And just there you were right, said Mr. Listwell. I once had doubts on this point myself, but a conversation with Gerrit Smith, a man, by the way, that I wish you could see, for he is a devoted friend of your race, and I know he would receive you gladly, put an end to all my doubts on this point. But do not let me interrupt you. I had but one narrow escape during my whole journey, said Madison. Do let us hear of it, said Mr. Listwell. 2 weeks ago, continued Madison, after traveling all night, I was overtaken by daybreak, in what seemed to me an almost interminable wood. I deemed it unsafe to go farther, and, as usual, I looked around for a suitable tree in which to spend the day. I liked one with a bushy top, and found one just to my mind. Up I climbed, and hiding myself as well as I could, I, with this strap, pulling one out of his old coat pocket, lashed myself to a bough, and flattered myself that. Page 196. I should get a good night's sleep that day, but in this I was soon disappointed. I had scarcely got fastened to my natural hammock, when I heard the voices of a number of persons, apparently approaching the part of the woods where I was. Upon my word, sir, I dreaded more these human voices than I should have done those of wild beasts. I was at a loss to know what to do. If I descended, I should probably be discovered by the men, and if they had dogs I should, doubtless, be treed. It was an anxious moment, but hardships and dangers have been the accompaniments of my life, and have, perhaps, imparted to me a certain hardness of character, which, to some extent, adapts me to them. In my present predicament, I decided to hold my place in the treetop, and abide the consequences. But here I must disappoint you, for the men, who were all colored, halted at least 100 yards from me, and began with their axes, in right good earnest, to attack the trees. The sound of their laughing axes was like the report of as many well-charged pistols. By and by there came down at least a dozen trees with a terrible crash. They leaped upon the fallen trees with an air of victory. I could see no dog with them, and felt myself comparatively safe, though I could not forget the possibility that some freak or fancy might bring the axe a little nearer my dwelling than comported with my safety. There was no sleep for me that day, and I. Page 197. Wished for night. You may imagine that the thought of having the tree attacked under me was far from agreeable, and that it very easily kept me on the lookout. The day was not without diversion. The men at work seemed to be a gay set, and they would often make the woods resound with that uncontrolled laughter for which we, as a race, are remarkable. I held my place in the tree till sunset, saw the men put on their jackets to be off. I observed that all left the ground except one, whom I saw sitting on the side of a stump, with his head bowed, and his eyes apparently fixed on the ground. I became interested in him. After sitting in the position to which I have alluded 10 or 15 minutes, he left the stump, walked directly towards the tree in which I was secreted, and halted almost under the same. He stood for a moment and looked around, deliberately and reverently took off his hat, by which I saw that he was a man in the evening of life, slightly bald and quite grey. After laying down his hat carefully, he knelt and prayed aloud, and such a prayer, the most fervent, earnest, and solemn, to which I think I ever listened. After reverently addressing the Almighty, as the all-wise, all-good, and the common Father of all mankind, he besought God for grace, for strength, to bear up under, and to endure, as a good soldier, all the hardships and trials which beset the journey of life, and to enable him to live in a manner which accorded with the gospel of Christ. His soul now broke out in humble supplication. Page 198. For deliverance from bondage. O thou, said he, that hearest the raven's cry, take pity on poor me. O deliver me. O deliver me. In mercy, O God, deliver me from the chains and manifold hardships of slavery. With thee, O Father, all things are possible. Thou canst stand and measure the earth. Thou hast beheld and drove asunder the nations, all power is in thy hand, thou didst say of old, I have seen the affliction of my people, and am come to deliver them. O look down upon our afflictions, and have mercy upon us. But I cannot repeat his prayer, nor can I give you an idea of its deep pathos. I had given but little attention to religion, and had but little faith in it, yet, as the old man prayed, I felt almost like coming down and kneel by his side, and mingle my broken complaint with his. He had already gained my confidence, as how could it be otherwise? I knew enough of religion to know that the man who prays in secret is far more likely to be sincere than he who loves to pray standing in the street, or in the great congregation. When he arose from his knees, like another Zacchaeus, I came down from the tree. He seemed a little alarmed at first, but I told him my story, and the good man embraced me in his arms, and assured me of his sympathy. I was now about out of provisions, and thought I might safely ask him to help me replenish my store. He said he had no money, but if he had, he would freely give it me. I told him I had one. Page 199. It was all the money I had in the world. I gave it to him, and asked him to purchase some crackers and cheese, and to kindly bring me the balance, that I would remain in or near that place, and would come to him on his return, if he would whistle. He was gone only about an hour. Meanwhile, from some cause or other, I know not what, but as you shall see very wisely, I changed my place. On his return I started to meet him, but it seemed as if the shadow of approaching danger fell upon my spirit, and checked my progress. In a very few minutes, closely on the heels of the old man, I distinctly saw 14 men, with something like guns in their hands. "Oh! The old wretch!" exclaimed Mrs. Listwell. "He had betrayed you, had he?" "I think not," said Madison. "I cannot believe that the old man was to blame. He probably went into a store, asked for the articles for which I sent, and presented the bill I gave him, and it is so unusual for slaves in the country to have money, that fact, doubtless, excited suspicion, and gave rise to inquiry. I can easily believe that the truthfulness of the old man's character compelled him to disclose the facts, and thus were these bloodthirsty men put on my track. Of course I did not present myself, but hugged my hiding place securely. If discovered and attacked, I resolved to sell my life as dearly as possible." After searching about the wood silently for a time, the whole company gathered around the old. Page 200. Man, one charged him with lying, and called him an old villain, said he was a thief, charged him with stealing money, said if he did not instantly tell where he got it, they would take the shirt from his old back, and give him 39 lashes. "I did not steal the money," said the old man, "it was given me, as I told you at the store, and if the man who gave it me is not here, it is not my fault." "Hush! You lying old rascal, we'll make you smart for it. You shall not leave this spot until you have told where you got that money." They now took hold of him, and began to strip him, while others went to get sticks with which to beat him. I felt, at the moment, like rushing out in the midst of them, but considering that the old man would be whipped the more for having aided a fugitive slave, and that, perhaps, in the melee he might be killed outright, I disobeyed this impulse. They tied him to a tree, and began to whip him. My own flesh crept at every blow, and I seemed to hear the old man's piteous cries even now. They laid 39 lashes on his bare back, and were going to repeat that number, when one of the company besought his comrades to desist. "You'll kill the deedy old scoundrel. You've already whipped $1 worth out of him, even if he stole it." "Oh yes," said another, "let him down. He'll never tell us another lie, I'll warrant ye." With this, one of the company untied the old man, and bid him go about his business. Page 201. The old man left, but the company remained as much as an hour, scouring the woods. Round and round they went, turning up the underbrush, and peering about like so many bloodhounds. 2 or 3 times they came within 6 feet of where I lay. I tell you I held my stick with a firmer grasp than I did in coming up to your house tonight. I expected to level one of them at least. Fortunately, however, I eluded their pursuit, and they left me alone in the woods. My last dollar was now gone, and you may well suppose I felt the loss of it, but the thought of being once again free to pursue my journey prevented that depression which a sense of destitution causes, so swinging my little bundle on my back, I caught a glimpse of the Great Bear, whichever points the way to my beloved star, and I started again on my journey. What I lost in money I made up at a hen roost that same night, upon which I fortunately came. "But you didn't eat your food raw? How did you cook it?" said Mrs. Listwell. "Oh no, madam," said Madison, turning to his little bundle I had the means of cooking. Here he took out of his bundle an old-fashioned tinder box, and taking up a piece of a file, which he brought with him, he struck it with a heavy flint, and brought out at least a dozen sparks at once. "I have had this old box," said he, "more than 5 years. It is the only property saved from the fire in the Dismal Swamp. It has done me." Page 202. Good service. "It has given me the means of broiling many a chicken." It seemed quite a relief to Mrs. Listwell to know that Madison had, at least, lived upon cooked food. Women have a perfect horror of eating uncooked food. By this time thoughts of what was best to be done about getting Madison to Canada began to trouble Mr. Listwell, for the laws of Ohio were very stringent against anyone who should aid, or who were found aiding a slave to escape through that state. A citizen, for the simple act of taking a fugitive slave in his carriage, had just been stripped of all his property, and thrown penniless upon the world. Notwithstanding this, Mr. Listwell was determined to see Madison safely on his way to Canada. "Give yourself no uneasiness," said he to Madison, "for if it cost my farm, I shall see you safely out of the States, and on your way to a land of liberty. Thank God that there is such a land so near us. You will spend tomorrow with us, and tomorrow night I will take you in my carriage to the lake. Once upon that, and you are safe." "Thank you. Thank you," said the fugitive, "I will commit myself to your care." For the first time during 5 years, Madison enjoyed the luxury of resting his limbs on a comfortable bed, and inside a human habitation. Looking at the white sheets, he said to Mr. Listwell, "What, sir? You don't mean that I shall sleep in that bed?" Page 203. "Oh yes, oh yes." After Mr. Listwell left the room, Madison said he really hesitated whether or not he should lie on the floor, for that was far more comfortable and inviting than any bed to which he had been used. We pass over the thoughts and feelings, the hopes and fears, the plans and purposes, that revolved in the mind of Madison during the day that he was secreted at the house of Mr. Listwell. The reader will be content to know that nothing occurred to endanger his liberty, or to excite alarm. Many were the little attentions bestowed upon him in his quiet retreat and hiding place. In the evening, Mr. Listwell, after treating Madison to a new suit of winter clothes, and replenishing his exhausted purse with $5, all in silver, brought out his 2-horse wagon, well provided with buffaloes, and silently started off with him to Cleveland. They arrived there without interruption, a few minutes before sunrise the next morning. Fortunately the steamer Admiral lay at the wharf, and was to start for Canada at 9 o'clock. Here the last anticipated danger was surmounted. It was feared that just at this point the hunters of men might be on the lookout, and, possibly, pounce upon their victim. Mr. Listwell saw the captain of the boat, cautiously sounded him on the matter of carrying liberty-loving passengers, before he introduced his precious charge. This done, Madison was conducted on board. With page 204. Usual generosity. This true subject of the emancipating Queen welcomed Madison, and assured him that he should be safely landed in Canada, free of charge. Madison now felt himself no more a piece of merchandise, but a passenger, and, like any other passenger, going about his business, carrying with him what belonged to him, and nothing which rightfully belonged to anybody else. Wrapped in his new winter suit, snug and comfortable, a pocket full of silver, safe from his pursuers, embarked for a free country, Madison gave every sign of sincere gratitude, and bade his kind benefactor farewell, with such a grip of the hand as bespoke a heart full of honest manliness, and a soul that knew how to appreciate kindness. It need scarcely be said that Mr. Listwell was deeply moved by the gratitude and friendship he had excited in a nature so noble as that of the fugitive. He went to his home that day with a joy and gratification which knew no bounds. He had done something to deliver the spoiled out of the hands of the spoiler, he had given bread to the hungry, and clothes to the naked. He had befriended a man to whom the laws of his country forbade all friendship, and in proportion to the odds against his righteous deed, was the delightful satisfaction that gladdened his heart. On reaching home, he exclaimed, "He is safe, he is safe, he is safe," and the cup of his joy was shared by his excellent lady. The following letter was received from Madison a few days after. Page 205. Windsor, Canada West, December 16, 1840. My dear friend, for such you truly are, Madison is out of the woods at last. I nestle in the mane of the British lion, protected by his mighty paw from the talons and the beak of the American eagle. I am free, and breathe an atmosphere too pure for slaves, slave hunters, or slaveholders. My heart is full. As many thanks to you, sir, and to your kind lady, as there are pebbles on the shores of Lake Erie, and may the blessing of God rest upon you both. You will never be forgotten by your profoundly grateful friend, Madison Washington. Part 3. His head was with his heart. And that was far away. Childe Harold. Just upon the edge of the great road from Petersburg, Virginia, to Richmond, and only about 15 miles from the latter place, there stands a somewhat ancient and famous public tavern, quite notorious in its better days, as being the grand resort for most of the leading gamblers, horse racers, cockfighters, and slave traders from all the country round about. This old rookery, the nucleus of all sorts of birds, mostly those of ill omen, has, like page 206, everything else peculiar to Virginia, lost much of its ancient consequence and splendor, yet it keeps up some appearance of gaiety and high life, and is still frequented, even by respectable travelers, who are unacquainted with its past history and present condition. Its fine old portico looks well at a distance, and gives the building an air of grandeur. A nearer view, however, does little to sustain this pretension. The house is large, and its style imposing, but time and dissipation, unfailing in their results, have made ineffaceable marks upon it, and it must, in the common course of events, soon be numbered with the things that were. The gloomy mantle of ruin is, already, outspread to envelop it, and its remains, even but now remind one of a human skull, after the flesh has mingled with the earth. Old hats and rags fill the places in the upper windows once occupied by large panes of glass, and the molding boards along the roofing have dropped off from their places, leaving holes and crevices in the rented wall for bats and swallows to build their nests in. The platform of the portico, which fronts the highway, is a rickety affair. Its planks are loose, and in some places entirely gone, leaving effective man-traps in their stead for nocturnal ramblers. The wooden pillars, which once supported it, but which now hang as encumbrances, are all rotten, and tremble with the touch. A part of the stable, a fine old structure in its day, which has given comfortable shelter to hundreds of the noblest steeds of. Page 207. The old Dominion at once, was blown down many years ago, and never has been, and probably never will be, rebuilt. The doors of the barn are in wretched condition. They will shut with a little human strength to help their worn-out hinges, but not otherwise. The side of the great building seen from the road is much discolored in sundry places by slops poured from the upper windows, rendering it unsightly and offensive in other respects. 3 or 4 great dogs, looking as dull and gloomy as the mansion itself, lie stretched out along the door-sills under the portico, and double the number of loafers, some of them completely rum-ripe, and others ripening, dispose themselves like so many sentinels about the front of the house. These latter understand the science of scraping acquaintance to perfection. They know everybody, and almost everybody knows them. Of course, as their title implies, they have no regular employment. They are, to use an expressive phrase, hangers-on, or still better, they are what sailors would denominate holders-on to the slack, in everybody's mess, and in nobody's watch. They are, however, as good as the newspaper for the events of the day, and they sell their knowledge almost as cheap. Money they seldom have, yet they always have capital the most reliable. They make their way with a succeeding traveler by intelligence gained from a preceding one. All the great names of Virginia they know by heart, and have seen their owners often. The history of the page 208. House is folded in their lips, and they rattle off stories in connection with it, equal to the guides at Dryburgh Abbey. He must be a shrewd man, and well skilled in the art of evasion, who gets out of the hands of these fellows without being at the expense of a treat. It was at this old tavern, while on a second visit to the state of Virginia in 1841, that Mr.